"You can't handle even my," said the giantess Apache woman,
We'll make sure.
but Cowboy proved her wrong. And before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The Wyoming plains held a quiet that came only before full nightfall, when the sky still carried a faint wash of pale color and the wind moved low across the open ground without rushing. Marcus Hale walked the length of his fence with slow, practiced steps, checking each rail with the calm focus of a man who depended on routine more than anything else. His cattle operation had never grown into much. Half the land produced barely enough to justify staying, and the rest fought him with every season. Still, he remained, because the land gave him distance from the noise he used to drown in, and because solitude kept the memories he didn't want under control. Marcus had lived alone for several years after leaving a supply job that kept him traveling between forts and settlements. Losing too many people to accidents, winter storms, and pointless violence had worn him down until he could no longer listen to others talk about their luck or their grief. So he settled on a quiet stretch of prairie, built a small cabin, and worked the same path every day: water, repairs, cattle, firewood, because predictable tasks made the empty spaces in his mind easier to manage. As he reached the cottonwood stand near the dry creek bed, he tapped one of the fence posts and listened for weakness in the wood. That was when he heard something break the stillness, a single, steady step over thin mud. It was not the careless movement of an animal and not the quick scramble of someone hiding. Marcus straightened, his hand brushing the butt of his rifle without taking it off his shoulder. His heartbeat picked up, not with panic, but with the alertness he had never fully shaken from his old traveling days. A tall silhouette separated from the shadows beneath the cottonwoods. At first, it looked impossibly large, tall enough to draw his eyes higher than he expected. Nokomi stepped forward with deliberate movements, her shoulders squared, her hands held open where he could see them. She stopped several paces away, standing against the dimming light of the sky. Her condition showed the strain she had endured. One boot missing, her right wrist swollen and held close to her body, her shirt torn along the seam near her ribs, and dried dirt clinging to her skin as if she had been on the move for days. Her breathing remained even, controlled by force of will, and her expression gave away nothing except the kind of weariness born from too many close calls. She looked like a woman who had been pushed out of familiar territory and forced to walk until her options narrowed to nothing. Marcus felt tension rise in the back of his throat, not from fear but from trying to understand what he was seeing. Apache women did not travel alone unless driven from their people, and anyone walking the plains in such condition carried danger behind them. Hostile encounters, patrols, hunger, or worse. He kept his stance neutral, lowering his chin slightly, signaling he wasn't preparing to strike or chase her away. She scanned him with a sharp, quick assessment, as if determining whether he was another threat she needed to prepare for. For a brief moment, her gaze flicked toward the pump beside the barn. Marcus noticed the motion and stepped aside. He didn't speak yet. He understood that some people needed proof of safety before they could handle conversation. He raised his hand slightly, pointing to the pump. Nokomi's approached the pump with a long stride, even though exhaustion clung to her movements. Her height became even more striking as she passed him, towering nearly a head above him. She gripped the handle with her good hand and worked it until water flowed, letting it run over her fingers before drinking in long, steady pulls. The relief showed in her shoulders, which dropped a degree once the thirst eased. Marcus watched her carefully, trying to read her intentions. She didn't carry a weapon. She didn't show fear. She didn't glance around as if expecting an ambush. She stood like someone who had endured too much to bother pretending she needed permission to survive. She straightened and looked at him fully for the first time. Her voice came out low and controlled, holding a firm edge that did not shake even under strain. "You couldn't handle even my strength." The words weren't a threat. They were a warning shaped by long experience. Men misunderstood her size, mocked her, challenged her, or tried to overpower her. Marcus recognized the strain behind her posture, the way she braced herself for the dismissal she expected. He answered with an even tone. Then don't ask me to. Nokomi's paused, narrowing her eyes slightly as she evaluated the meaning behind his reply. She seemed to register that he had not stepped toward her or flinched or tried to force conversation. She looked at him like a person revising an assumption. Marcus turned toward the cabin and began walking, leaving the door unlatched behind him. The gesture wasn't an invitation and wasn't a command. It simply left room for her to choose what she needed. In his mind, he weighed the risks of letting her near his home, but he also weighed the reality that she was injured and alone. He wasn't a man who hunted trouble, but he wasn't going to push a wounded person back into the open plains. Nokomi's remained by the pump for several seconds, scanning the empty horizon as if confirming that no one followed her. The plain stretched wide and exposed in every direction. She would have no cover if someone intended to track her. After a long, careful breath, she walked toward the cabin. Her footsteps were firm, her posture unbroken despite her injuries. When she reached the doorway, she hesitated just long enough to test the air inside. Heat from the stove, the scent of beans cooking, the sound of Marcus shifting something on the table. Then she stepped inside and filled the narrow entryway with her imposing height. Marcus looked up from the pot, meeting her eyes without hesitation. He didn't ask who she was, or what happened, or why she had crossed his land. He simply gave a small nod. Nokomi's didn't thank him. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain her presence. She was a woman who had spent too long being judged for her size, her heritage, her abilities. Gratitude would come later, if ever. Safety needed to be proven. She crossed the room and sat near the wall, her injured wrist held protectively near her stomach. Marcus returned to the stove, stirring the beans with steady movements. The quiet settled between them in a way that didn't feel strained. Neither trusted easily, but neither turned away. In that small cabin lit by a single lamp, two strangers, one worn down by solitude, the other worn down by survival, began the slow process of deciding whether they could exist in the same space without tearing at each other's wounds. Outside, the plains darkened fully for the night, unaware that something irreversible had already begun. The cabin held a steady heat from the stove, its metal body humming quietly as Marcus added another piece of wood and closed the door with a firm click. The warmth spread through the room in slow waves, softening the bite of the wind that had followed Nokomi's inside. Marcus moved with deliberate care, keeping his gestures small and predictable so he didn't startle her or push her into a defensive stance. He had been around enough wounded travelers to know sudden motions could create misunderstandings. Nokomi sat near the wall where the shadows met the lamplight, her back straight, her knees slightly bent to fit within the cabin's limited space. She pulled her injured wrist closer to her chest, not to hide it, but to ease the pressure. Her eyes tracked every part of the room, the stove, the table, the bed frame, the shelves, examining each object with the precision of someone who had learned to identify danger in a single glance. She didn't shift her posture even after several minutes, choosing stillness as her first line of control. Marcus ladled stew into 2 tin bowls, setting one on the table and sliding the other toward her across the wooden floor. The bowl stopped a few inches from her foot. Nokomi's didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she watched him for a long second, as if confirming he wasn't expecting conversation or obedience. When she finally took the bowl, she held it firmly but carefully, keeping her fingers away from the rim where the metal retained heat. She tasted the food without hesitation. Hunger showed in the way she swallowed quickly, though she kept her expression neutral. Marcus ate slower, giving her space to finish first if she wanted. He noticed the tension along her jaw, not anger, but a familiar conflict between pride and necessity. She didn't like needing anything from a stranger. The wind pressed against the shutters, rattling them lightly. Nokomi's turned her head toward the sound, checking for approaching boots or horses, but the noise remained steady and harmless. She let her shoulders drop a fraction before resuming her meal. Marcus finished eating and stood to wash the tin bowls in a small basin. He didn't ask her where she came from or who had hurt her wrist. He didn't inquire about threats or enemies. He sensed those questions would push her away instead of grounding her. Instead, he spoke only when necessary. "You can stay inside tonight," he said, keeping his voice calm and even. Nokomi's lifted her gaze slowly. Her expression held a seriousness that made it clear she didn't mistake the offer for charity. She assessed him again. The firmness in his stance, the absence of judgment in his tone, the practiced control in his movements. She had encountered men who offered help only to demand something later. Marcus didn't resemble them. He acted like someone maintaining order in his living space rather than inviting trouble into it. She nodded once, a short gesture more like an agreement than gratitude. Marcus pulled a rolled blanket from a trunk and placed it within her reach. She stared at it for a moment, trying to decide if taking it signaled vulnerability. After a brief hesitation, she leaned forward and pulled the blanket to her lap. She didn't wrap herself immediately. She sat with the fabric resting over her legs, testing whether accepting even this small comfort shifted the balance between them. While she did that, Marcus extinguished the lamp and moved toward the chair beside the stove. He didn't go to the bed. He'd made his decision earlier. She needed the cabin's warmest spot and the security of knowing he wasn't closing in on her while she slept. Nokomi's noticed. Her eyes lingered on him as he settled into the chair, stretching his legs slightly, keeping both hands visible. She studied him as if she still didn't understand why he maintained distance when so many men would have done the opposite. "You sleep there?" she asked quietly. "Yes." Her brow tightened slightly. Not suspicion, curiosity. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and lay down on the floor near the stove, adjusting her body until she found a position that eased the pull in her wrist. She faced him rather than the wall, wanting to see any movement from him through the night. The room dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the coals inside the stove. The shadows shifted across the ceiling as the wind pressed against the walls. Nokomi's exhaled slowly, releasing a measure of tension she had held since stepping into his yard. She didn't feel safe yet, but she didn't feel hunted either. Marcus rested his head back against the chair and watched her with quiet awareness. He didn't see an intruder or a burden. He saw someone carrying a level of exhaustion he recognized from men who had walked too many miles with too little support. He knew he wasn't responsible for her choices, but he also knew he couldn't turn her out in her condition. Nokomi's closed her eyes, though not fully. Sleep didn't come easily to her. She kept her senses trained on the pattern of his breathing, the creak of the wooden beams, and the faint shake of the window latch. Everything unfamiliar had to be monitored until proven harmless. Only near dawn did her breathing finally deepen. Marcus stayed awake longer, listening to the same cabin sounds, thinking about what tomorrow would bring. He had lived alone long enough that the presence of another person, especially one like her, pulled at parts of him he had kept locked down. Not longing, not fear, just awareness that his routine had shifted, and with that shift came responsibility. As the fire dimmed to red embers, one clear truth settled between them. She had chosen not to run, and he had chosen not to send her away. The first light of dawn slipped across the plains in thin, steady lines, revealing frost clinging to every blade of grass outside the cabin. Marcus Hale stepped out into the cold air and shut the door softly behind him, careful not to disturb Nokomi's, though he suspected she was already awake. Years of living alone had made him light-footed at sunrise, but years of surviving hardship had made her even lighter. He crossed the yard to the small shed, collected the tools for the morning's work, and paused to study the fence line he had walked the night before. The rails nearest the barn had sagged from ground shift that needed fixing before he thought about cattle feed or water barrels. He planned out the tasks in his mind the way he always did, step by step, nothing rushed. It helped him stay organized, especially now that he had someone else on the property who might need assistance. When he turned back toward the cabin, he saw Nokomi's standing just outside the doorway. She had risen without a sound. The blanket had been folded neatly and placed on the table. She looked more alert than she had the previous night, though her swollen wrist still throbbed based on the way she held it close to her ribs. Her eyes drifted across the yard, assessing the land in a slow sweep. She studied the barn, the pump, the open stretch of prairie, and the horse pen. She took in everything as if creating a mental map in case she needed to leave quickly. Marcus recognized the instinct. He used to do the same in unfamiliar territory. "You hungry?" he asked. She considered him briefly before nodding once. It wasn't enthusiasm. It was acknowledgement of a need she had no reason to hide. Marcus walked back inside, prepared a simple pan of cornbread and beans, and set a plate on the table for her. She sat with controlled movements, lowering herself into the chair as though testing its durability. She didn't start eating until he sat down across from her, which told him she wasn't waiting for permission. She was waiting to see the rules of the household. After breakfast, Marcus stepped outside again to begin repairs. He expected Nokomi's to stay near the cabin or rest by the stove, but she followed him into the yard with quiet determination. She stopped beside the fallen section of fence and studied the rails with a narrowed gaze. "You fix this every spring?" she asked. "Every spring," he said. Without asking, she moved toward the barn and found a loose plank leaning against the wall. She picked it up with her good hand and carried it effortlessly across the yard, her steps firm on the frozen ground. Marcus watched, but didn't intervene. He learned early in life that some people needed work more than rest because work gave them direction. Nokomi's crouched at the broken post, inspecting the crack. She touched the damaged area carefully, not because she feared splinters, but because she wanted to understand the structure before applying force. Her wrist prevented her from gripping tools with both hands, yet she didn't allow the injury to limit her entirely. She used her uninjured arm to steady the replacement plank while Marcus hammered it into place. The rhythm developed naturally. She held. He nailed, without either giving orders. It was a quiet partnership formed minute by minute, task by task. At one point, Nokomi shifted her weight to her knees and went slightly. Marcus noticed the subtle change in her breathing. "You should rest that arm," he said. "It holds enough for this," she replied. He didn't argue. She didn't need sympathy. She needed stability and a chance to reclaim whatever control she had left after arriving injured and alone. He gave her space to decide her limits. When the fence repair was complete, Nokomi's rose and looked across the yard again. Her expression changed slightly, less guarded, more calculating, as though assessing whether this land could support her if she stayed. Marcus didn't press her about her plans. He understood that she lived day to day right now. "This place always this empty?" she asked. "Most days," he answered. "I keep it that way on purpose." Her gaze returned to him. She seemed to understand the truth in that sentence. Solitude wasn't a punishment here. It was a shield he had chosen. Together, they moved to the barn. Marcus checked feed levels and water buckets, while Nokomi's tested the door hinges and studied the rafters for weak spots. She handled tasks in silence, learning the ropes of the place without asking for a roll. Inside, the horse snorted softly. Nokomi's approached the stall with slow, steady steps. She extended her good hand so the animal could sniff her fingers. The horse accepted her presence without shying away. Marcus observed this carefully. Animals sense tension better than people, and the horse's calm told him Nokomi's carried no volatile anger beneath her surface, only fatigue and guarded resilience. By midday, the sun melted the frost enough to soften the ground. Marcus wiped his hands on a cloth and leaned against the barn door to rest. Nokomi stood near him, her breathing slightly heavier from the work. "You didn't need to help," he said. "I do better moving than sitting," she answered, keeping her eyes on the fence they repaired. He believed her. Movement meant control. Control meant safety. Marcus noticed something else then, a small tremor in her fingers caused by the strain on her wrist. He walked toward the cabin and retrieved a strip of cloth, then returned and held it out. "For your wrist," he said. "It'll stabilize it." Nokomi's hesitated, not because she mistrusted the cloth, but because accepting help meant acknowledging weakness. After a long moment, she extended her arm. Marcus wrapped the cloth carefully, never gripping too tightly, keeping his touch steady and polite. Her muscles tensed only once, then settled as she tested the support. "It holds better," she said quietly. "It will heal if you let it rest between tasks." She didn't commit to resting. She only nodded. The rest of the afternoon moved calmly. No loud voices, no unexpected threats, just two people falling into a routine neither had planned for. No Comey's watched Marcus work, learning how he maintained his land. Marcus paid attention to the way she scanned the horizon with instinctual precision. As the sun lowered toward the west, her eyes stayed on the distant ridge. She spoke with quiet certainty. "No one follow me here." Marcus didn't ask why she needed to say it. He simply nodded. But her next words held even more weight. For now, they both understood. Peace was temporary, but temporary peace could still be used to build something steady. One day at a time, one chore at a time, one quiet decision at a time. The following afternoon carried a dry wind from the south, warm enough to lift dust across the yard but sharp enough to sting the skin. Marcus Hale worked near the horse pen, tightening a length of rope while his gelding stood still, ears flicking at distant sounds. The animal's sudden shift in posture made Marcus pause. When the horse raised its head and stared toward the open trail, Marcus followed its gaze. A wagon appeared over the rise, two mules pulling a weather-beaten cart loaded with sacks, tools, and scrap iron. Two men rode on the bench, both dressed in patched coats and wide-brim hats that shaded their faces. They weren't men Marcus recognized immediately, which meant they were passing traders or drifters seeking to sell whatever they had collected along the frontier. Travelers like these often carried news, gossip, and trouble without distinguishing between them. Marcus set down the rope and stepped toward the porch with calm, measured steps. He didn't reach for a weapon, but he rested one hand casually near his belt, ready if needed. He had long learned that most problems could be settled by posture, not bullets. No Comeys emerged from behind the barn, having just finished checking the feed barrels. The movement of the wagon drew her attention instantly. She stood beside the barn door, partially hidden but not concealed, her injured wrist bound in cloth, her shoulders drawn back, her expression unreadable. Her height alone made the two traders lean forward on their seat as they approached, confusion spreading across their faces. The wagon slowed to a creaking halt at the edge of the yard. The older of the two men lifted his hat slightly in greeting, though his eyes never left Nokomi's. "Afternoon," he said. "We're looking to trade for grain, tools, or scrap metal if you've got some spare." Marcus nodded once. "I might have a few things. Depends what you're offering." The younger man nudged the older with his elbow and whispered something Marcus couldn't fully hear, but the tone carried mockery. Both men kept glancing at Nokomi's with amused disbelief, as if they had never seen a woman of her size outside of tall tales told in saloons. Nokomi's didn't flinch. She held her position beside the barn, chin high, eyes sharp, maintaining calm even as the scrutiny intensified. Marcus stepped closer to the wagon, blocking the men's direct view of her. He didn't make a show of the gesture. He simply adjusted his stance, so she wasn't being openly inspected. The older man took note and cleared his throat. "Didn't mean no disrespect," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just ain't every day you see a woman like that living on a white man's spread." Nokomi's shifted her weight slowly. Her jaw tightened, and a quiet tension rolled through her shoulders. The last thing she wanted was to be reduced to spectacle again. She had endured enough of that from curious soldiers and hostile settlers. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward or threaten. Instead, he kept his expression flat. "She works here," he said simply. "That's all you need to know." The younger man snorted. "Working or not, a giant woman like her." Before he could finish, Nokomi's stepped away from the barn. She didn't rush. She didn't glare. She walked forward with steady, deliberate strides until she stood several feet from the wagon. Her presence alone silenced both men. She didn't fold her arms or puff her chest. She just existed without shrinking, and that was enough to pierce whatever amusement they had carried. "You done staring?" she asked, her voice low, calm, and direct. The older man swallowed hard and nodded, his confidence faltering. The younger looked down at his hands, uncomfortable now that she had addressed him without fear. Marcus didn't smile or smirk. He didn't need to. He opened the barn door and pulled out 2 sacks of grain. "You want to trade?" he said, We trade. If not, keep moving. The men exchanged glances. Neither wanted to admit they felt unsettled, but both understood they were no longer in control of the conversation. They shifted in their seats and produced a few iron tools and a bundle of dried herbs. Marcus examined the items, selected what he could use, and then handed over the grain with calm finality. When the transaction ended, the men flicked the reins hastily. The wagon rolled out without any parting insults or lingering looks. They kept their heads forward the entire time, eager to clear the property. When the wagon disappeared over the ridge, Nokomi's exhaled slowly, letting her muscles relax one piece at a time. She looked at Marcus, searching his face for any sign of frustration or hidden judgment. "You didn't need to stand between us," she said. "I didn't," Marcus replied. "I stood where I always stand." She studied him for a moment, trying to determine whether he meant it or whether he was simply avoiding conflict. Marcus didn't elaborate. He turned toward the barn and resumed checking the tools they had received in the trade. Nokomi's remained still, caught between confusion and cautious appreciation. She was used to men mocking her size, fearing her strength, or using her presence to brag. Marcus had done none of those things. He treated her like a person performing a job on the land. Nothing more, nothing less. That quiet treatment created an unexpected shift inside her. Not gratitude, not trust, something closer to recognition. The world outside would always stare, always question her right to exist. But here, for the first time in months, someone had refused to see her as a joke or a threat. As Marcus walked past her into the barn, he said only one thing: "We've got more work before sundown." Nokomi's followed him without hesitation. The air cooled sharply after sunset, carrying a crisp bite that slipped through the open spaces between the cabin boards. Marcus Hale shut the shutters one by one, securing each latch with practiced motions. The warmth inside remained steady thanks to the stove burning low in the corner, but he knew the temperature would drop fast once night settled fully across the plains. Nokomi sat at the small table, her injured wrist resting against her thigh, her posture straight but less rigid than the night she arrived. She had spent most of the afternoon mending her torn shirt with thread Marcus kept in a tin box. The stitches looked clean for someone using one hand, tight, even, and placed with careful pressure that avoided strain on her swollen joint. She didn't speak while she worked, and Marcus didn't interrupt except to set a cup of warm tea beside her. She drank it without comment. When she finished sewing, she folded the shirt neatly and placed it on the edge of the table. Marcus watched her glance toward the bed only once, a quick look that revealed calculation rather than comfort. A single bed meant choice: stay on the floor, take the bed, or ask what Marcus expected of her. None of those options sat easily with someone who had lived too long defending her autonomy. Marcus opened the stove door and added more wood, letting the fire flare before closing it. The glow cast an uneven light across the room, illuminating Nokomi's strong features in shifting patches of amber. She traced the wrap cloth around her wrist with her fingers, checking for tightness. The swelling had gone down slightly, though the injury still limited her grip. "You'll need to rest that arm overnight," Marcus said evenly. "Strain will slow the healing." She held his gaze. "I don't sleep well when I'm hurt. You'll rest better off the floor." His tone offered information, not instruction. He didn't look toward the bed when he said it. He knew if he did, she might read expectation where there was none. Instead, he sat down in the chair by the stove, the same place he had slept the previous night, making it clear she wouldn't be crowded. Nokomi stood slowly, testing her balance. She approached the bed, touching the wooden frame with her fingertips. It was a small bed, sturdy but not built for someone her size. She pressed down lightly on the mattress, assessing its firmness. Marcus didn't move from his chair. He remained still with his hands resting loosely on his knees, letting her control the moment. She sat first, lowering herself with deliberate care. The frame creaked once under her weight, but it held. She waited a long moment, listening for any sign of objection. None came. Then she stretched out, keeping her injured wrist resting safely against her side. She didn't pull the blanket up immediately. She lay still, watching Marcus as the firelight flickered across the room. "You sleep there by choice?" she asked, her voice quiet but direct. "Yes," he replied. "Gives you the bed without question." She considered his answer carefully. She was familiar with men who demanded closeness when none was offered, who used shelter as leverage. Marcus had made no move toward her, no suggestion of shared space, no indication that he saw her as anything but another person needing warmth for the night. "You don't want anything from me," she said, not as a compliment, but as a fact she needed confirmed. "No," Marcus answered. "You're hurt. That's all that matters right now." For the first time since she arrived, her expression softened. Not a smile, not relief, but a reduction of the tension that lived permanently across her brow. She pulled the blanket over herself and lay her head on the pillow, adjusting until her body fit along the narrow space without discomfort. The wind pushed against the shutters again, rattling them in short bursts. Nokomi's eyes flicked toward the sound, instinctively alert, but settled when she recognized it as harmless. Marcus leaned back in the chair, stretching his legs toward the stove. He didn't close his eyes yet. He watched the fire shift and break apart, thinking about the changes happening inside his own home. He couldn't deny that her presence disrupted the stillness he had grown used to, but didn't bother him the way he expected. Instead, it reminded him of a life that felt more purposeful than the solitude he had kept for years. Nokomi's shifted on the bed, testing the comfort. Her body relaxed gradually, inch by inch, once she accepted the mattress would not collapse under her. Her breathing slowed, becoming deeper and steadier. Sleep didn't claim her quickly, but it came without the sharp, defensive breaths she had taken the night before. Before drifting off, she opened her eyes one more time. "You treat me like I belong in this room," she said softly. Marcus glanced toward her, not moving from his chair. "You do, for as long as you choose to stay." She absorbed his words with a thoughtful stillness. Then she closed her eyes and allowed sleep to take her. Marcus remained awake until the fire settled into glowing coals. He listened to the steady rhythm of her breathing and realized it had been a long time since another person slept safely under his roof. Outside, the plane stayed quiet. Inside, the fragile beginnings of trust settled between them, unspoken but unmistakable. The next day carried a dry, restless wind that swept across the plains with long gusts, pushing grit against the cabin walls and making the tall grass bend in uneven waves. Marcus Hale stepped out early, checking the sky for storm signs, while Nokomi's lifted a bucket from the well with her uninjured arm, the rope sliding steadily through her hand. She had slept more deeply than she expected, though her wrist still throbbed. She ignored the pain and moved with quiet discipline, never asking for assistance. Marcus noticed the slight tension around her eyes as she set the bucket down. "You should keep that wrist idle a while," he said. "It moves enough for now," she replied, her tone even. He didn't argue. She knew her own limits better than anyone. They went about the morning chores with a rhythm that had begun forming naturally. He checked the animals, she sorted the woodpile, he fixed the barn hinge, she inspected the tack. Each task passed without wasted movement or confusion. Nokomi's learned the property's layout with swift precision, memorizing distances, angles, and paths. Marcus observed her quietly. She didn't drift, didn't hesitate. Every step she took showed intention. Mid-morning brought a sound that stiffened both their postures. Distant hooves, 3 sets approaching fast. Marcus turned toward the open trail, while Nokomi's stepped instinctively to the right of the barn door, taking a position where she had full view of the yard, but kept a barrier at her back. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders squared, and her gaze sharpened, not out of panic, but readiness. 3 riders came into sight, dust rising behind them in a tightening trail. Their coats slapped in the wind, and their horses came to a halt a few yards from the cabin. These weren't traders. Their posture mattered, back stiff, chins up, reins held high. Men who believed their presence alone commanded authority. Marcus walked forward with controlled steps. He didn't greet them, didn't posture, didn't draw his gun. He simply stopped where their eyes could meet his without tension. The lead rider, A heavy-set man with a trimmed mustache and a badge pinned loosely to his vest scanned the yard slowly. His gaze landed on no Comey's and stayed there longer than necessary. "That an Apache woman here?" he asked, voice raised just enough to project dominance. Marcus kept his expression neutral. "She's here." The second rider leaned forward in his saddle, mouth twisting with suspicion. "You talking her in as a worker, or is something else going on?" No Comey stepped into view fully, tall enough that all three men adjusted their posture without meaning to. Her size erased whatever false confidence they'd arrived with. She didn't speak yet. She waited to see if their intentions were real or fabricated. The lead rider crossed his arms. "Had reports of Apache strays passing close to these parts. Some folks get nervous. Some think they ought to be rounded up before trouble starts." No Comey's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't flinch. She had heard variations of those claims all her life, always from men who feared anything they couldn't control. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low but unshaken. "She's not causing trouble." "That your word?" the rider asked. "It is." The men exchanged glances, unsure how to interpret his calm. They expected excuses, defensiveness, or bravado. Marcus offered none. He stood where he always stood, steady, unprovoked, unmoved. The youngest rider shifted uneasily. "A woman her size, folks will talk. They'll think something's wrong with her." "With you too." No Comey's responded before Marcus could. Her voice was clear, unstrained, and measured. "They can think what they want." The bluntness startled the men. She wasn't asking for acceptance. She wasn't explaining her presence. She wasn't apologizing. Marcus didn't smile, but something in his posture settled. Her words matched his approach to life more than anything he could have said. The lead rider cleared his throat. Irritated, he wasn't controlling the conversation. "If she's staying here, you're responsible for her. If any trouble follows," Marcus cut in gently, "then I'll handle it." No Comey's glanced at him, observing how he chose his words. He didn't claim ownership. He didn't claim authority. He simply drew a boundary around his land and stood by it. The riders shifted in their saddles, realizing they weren't going to intimidate either of them. They turned their horses and rode off, dust scattering behind them in uneven bursts. When the sound of hooves faded, No Comey's loosened her stance. Her jaw unclenched slowly. She watched Marcus for a long moment, studying the steadiness he'd shown in front of armed men who believed they had higher rights. "You didn't move behind me," she said quietly. "You didn't need me to," he replied. "You didn't move in front either. You didn't want that." No Comey's considered his words. He was right. She wanted neither shielding nor abandonment, only clarity. Marcus seemed to understand this instinctively. After a long pause, she added, "Most men talk too much when challenged. Talking loud doesn't fix anything," Marcus said as he walked toward the barn. "Standing still usually does more." No Comey's followed him, the wind lifting her hair across her shoulder. She felt something shift inside her, not gratitude, not relief, something closer to recognition that the man she was learning to trust operated by principles she understood deeply. They returned to the day's work without another word. But the silence between them held new meaning now, mutual acknowledgement that neither would bend under the weight of outside judgment. And that simple truth settled more strongly than any promise spoken aloud. The morning after the rider's visit arrived calm, with a thin layer of fog rising from the ground and drifting slowly across the yard. The sky carried a muted brightness that hinted spring had finally begun to push winter back. Marcus Hale stood near the barn with a coil of rope over his shoulder, checking the posts along the south pasture. Heavy snow from earlier weeks had loosened several fence lines, and he wanted them secure before the thaw softened the ground further. No Comey's approached from the cabin, her wrist wrapped neatly in the cloth he had given her. The swelling had gone down considerably, though she still moved her hand carefully. She joined him without being asked, stepping over a patch of damp earth with practiced precision. The fog clung to the back of her shirt and boots, outlining her tall frame against the pale morning light. "South fence needs new posts," Marcus said, lifting one of the weakened rails. No Comey's examined the damage, running her good hand along the wood. Ground shifted, she noted. Too much melt too fast. He nodded. She understood land the same way he did, by looking at it, touching it, reading what it was trying to tell them. Marcus gathered the tools from the barn, while Nokomi's selected replacement posts from the stack behind the shed. She carried one on her shoulder, steady and balanced, though her injured wrist limited her from using both hands. She didn't ask for assistance. She didn't slow her pace. When they reached the south pasture, the rising sun broke through the fog, revealing uneven patches of grass flattened by melt runoff. Marcus knelt beside the first broken post and began digging a new hole, his shoulders working with controlled strength. Nokomi stood beside him and held the new post upright when he finished, her stance firm even on the damp ground. "You used to do this alone?" she asked, adjusting her grip. "Always," Marcus answered. "Fence was my responsibility. And now? Now it's ours for as long as you're here." She didn't reply immediately. The word ours didn't frighten her, but it required consideration. She wasn't accustomed to share duties that didn't come with claims or expectations. Still, she held the post steady and let the statement settle inside her. Marcus hammered the soil back into place around the post, packing it tight. He moved to the next one, and Nokomi's followed without hesitation. Their rhythm grew smoother with each repair. No discussion, no repeating instructions, just an unspoken understanding of who handled which steps. Around midday, they stopped near a fallen log for a brief rest. Marcus handed her a tin cup filled with water from the canteen. She drank slowly, tilting her head back, her eyes drifting over the open stretch of land. The breeze carried the smell of wet soil and distant sagebrush. "This place," she said quietly. "It sits alone but holds steady." "That's why I stayed here," Marcus replied. "Noise doesn't reach this far." She studied him for a moment. "Silence doesn't bother you." It's the only thing that ever made sense. Her eyes remained on him longer than usual, as if she were comparing his answer to the truth she had seen in his movements since arriving. No boastfulness, no fear of solitude, no hunger for control. Just a man who wanted his land to stay in order and the people within it to remain undisturbed. They resumed work shortly after. Nokomi's carried another post across the uneven ground, moving with even strides despite the strain. Marcus watched the way she adjusted her movements around her injured wrist, refusing to let pain dictate her pace. He admired the discipline, though he said nothing. Later, as they finished the last section of fence, Marcus stood back and inspected the line. It held straight against the wind, each post firmly set. Nokomi stepped beside him, her breathing slightly heavy but controlled. "You work like someone who's been fighting the land for years," she observed. "That's how it stays alive," he said. "And you," she added, "you stay alive because you won't let it push you over." Marcus lifted his gaze toward the horizon. "You see the land clearly. So do you." They returned to the cabin as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows behind them. Nokomi's paused near the porch, looking back toward the fence they'd repaired. Her lips parted slightly, not in a smile, but in recognition that they had completed something together, something she hadn't expected to care about. Inside the cabin, Marcus poured 2 cups of warm water infused with herbs from his small supply. He handed one to her without ceremony. She accepted it without hesitation. "You don't question me," she said after a moment, setting the cup on the table. "You haven't lied," he answered. "And if I leave, that's your decision." She looked down at her bandaged wrist, then lifted her gaze again. "I don't plan to." Marcus didn't react visibly, but something eased inside him, something steady and quiet, like a clasp being secured. Outside, the wind softened. Inside, for the first time since they'd met, Nokomi's allowed herself to breathe without preparing for the next threat. The evening settled slowly over the plains, leaving a soft amber glow stretched across the yard as Marcus finished storing the tools from the day's work. The repaired fence now ran straight along the south pasture, each post holding firm against the wind. He took a final look at the line before stepping toward the cabin, where thin threads of lamplight leaked from the window seams. The warm light contrasted sharply with the cooling air outside, and he brushed dust from his sleeves before pushing the door open. Inside, the cabin felt different than it had days before. Not larger, not smaller, simply occupied. There was the faint scent of herbs Marcus used to treat the swelling in Nokomi's wrist, the quiet creak of the floor as she moved near the stove, and a subtle shift in the air that came from people sharing space without conflict. Marcus set down the coil of rope he carried and glanced toward her. Nokomi stood beside the small table, sorting through the few belongings she had been able to salvage. A torn cloth pouch, a remaining boot with worn edges, a strip of leather that looked like it once belonged to a saddle cinch. She placed each item carefully on the table, as if arranging proof of her existence piece by piece. Her wrist remained wrapped, but she could move her fingers now with more ease. She rotated her hand gently, testing the healing progress. Marcus washed his hands at the basin, then leaned his hip against the table, watching her sort. He didn't interrupt. Her face showed a mixture of fatigue, concentration, and quiet decision-making, all contained behind her steady eyes. "You've been working that wrist too soon," Marcus said after a moment. "It needs to move or it will stiffen," she replied. "I know how my body heals." He nodded. She wasn't defensive, just certain. Her certainty was something he had come to understand well. She never spoke carelessly, never wasted breath, never exaggerated her abilities. Everything she said came from lived experience. Nokomi's finished folding the leather strip and then turned to face him. Her height forced Marcus to lift his chin slightly, yet he never looked intimidated. Their shared work had leveled the ground between them in ways neither expected. "I've been thinking," she said, her tone measured but weighted. Marcus waited. He sensed the importance of what she was preparing to say. "When I arrived here," she continued, "I did not plan to stay more than a night. I thought I would drink water, rest, and leave before dawn." Her fingers brushed the edge of the table. "But I watched how you live. You do not push. You do not demand. You do not fear my presence. You didn't give me reason to," Marcus replied. Nokomi stepped closer, closing the space between them with deliberate slowness. The fire crackled inside the stove, casting shifting shadows across her broad shoulders and strong jawline. Her expression held no uncertainty now, only clarity. "I choose to remain here," she said plainly. "Not because I cannot survive on my own. Not because I am wounded. Not because I owe you anything." Her voice lowered slightly. "I choose because this land and your way of living fit what I need." Marcus stayed still, his breath steady, though a subtle shift crossed his face, an acknowledgement that her words carried more weight than anything else she had shared. "You don't owe me an explanation," he said. "I know," she replied. "That is why I am giving it." She reached forward slowly, placing her good hand on the table beside his. She didn't touch him yet. She left half an inch of space between them, allowing him room to step back if he wished. Marcus didn't. He let his hand remain where it was, close enough that the warmth between their skin passed like quiet confirmation. Nokomi's continued, her voice softer now, but still unwavering. "I have walked far. I left everything behind because staying where I was meant losing myself. I came across your land thinking it would be another place to pass through." She paused, searching his face. "But you never tried to own me, judge me, or make decisions for me." Marcus exhaled slowly. "I don't want ownership. I want stability." "So do I," she said. A long silence settled, not heavy, not strained, simply full. Marcus moved his hand the final inch, letting his fingertips rest against hers. Her skin was warm, strong, steady. She didn't tighten her grip. He didn't take her hand fully. Their contact remained a simple point of understanding. "You sure?" he asked quietly. "This place isn't much." "It is enough for me," she replied. "And you are someone I can stand beside without shrinking or fighting." Her words struck him deeper than he expected. Marcus had spent years assuming his company brought little comfort to anyone. He carried himself quietly, avoided unnecessary talk, and held his emotions tight to avoid being overwhelmed by memories he kept buried. To hear someone say they wanted to remain by choice, not out of need or desperation, hit him harder than any blow he had taken. Nokomi stepped even closer, until their shoulders nearly touched. "I choose you," she said again, slower this time, as if sealing the decision. Marcus didn't lean away. His voice remained low, but not guarded. Then stay. The simple permission wasn't control, it was acceptance. Nokomi's let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She reached up and lightly placed her hand against his chest. Not forceful, not testing, simply resting it there. Marcus covered her hand with his own, holding it carefully so he didn't aggravate her healing wrist. For the first time since arriving, Nokomi's allowed her posture to soften fully. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing eased, and the harsh lines of tension that had lived across her brow since the night she appeared in the cottonwoods faded into something gentler. Marcus guided her toward the table where the stove's heat reached them both. They sat side by side without discussing where each should sit. Their shoulders brushed lightly, a contact neither pulled away from. The room felt smaller in a comfortable way, filled by two people who no longer needed to measure each other through caution. As they ate a simple dinner, they spoke little. They didn't need to. Every quiet moment confirmed their decision more than words could. Later, when Marcus set the lamp low and Nokomi's rose from the table, she didn't hesitate at the bed's edge. She placed her palm on the frame, glanced toward him once, and then laid down with calm certainty. Marcus followed after a moment, blowing out the lamp before settling beside her, leaving a respectful space between their bodies. Nokomi's didn't move closer. She didn't need to. The choice had already been made clearly, openly, and without pressure. Outside, the wind carried a gentler rhythm than the night before. Inside, a partnership, chosen freely by both, settled into place with steady warmth. The first signs of summer arrived quietly across the Wyoming plains. The wind lost its winter bite, the soil softened under Marcus Hale's boots, and the grass stretched higher each week in steady green patches. The land didn't change fast. It shifted slowly, the way people did when they finally had room to breathe. Marcus stood near the barn one morning, tightening a rope along the gate, when he heard Nokomi's step out of the cabin behind him. Her footsteps had become familiar, long, even confident. Not the cautious pace she'd carried when she first crossed his yard, not the guarded stiffness of someone expecting danger, but a steady gait shaped by certainty. She walked toward him with a small bundle in her hands. Her wrist, once badly swollen, had healed enough for her to lift heavier items, though she still avoided sudden pressure. Marcus watched her pass through the sunlight, noticing how the shadows cast by her tall frame stretched across the barn wall. The cloth shirt she wore moved lightly in the warm breeze, revealing strong shoulders and a quiet composure he'd grown used to seeing each morning. "You finished with the stitching?" Marcus asked, nodding at the bundle. "Yes," she said, setting it down on a ledge. "Your work coat needed patching. It won't tear again unless you fight a bear." Marcus let out a short breath through his nose, his closest form of amusement. "I don't plan on picking any fights." "I hope not. I just fixed it." She looked at him with a seriousness that made the comment sound almost literal, and Marcus felt the corner of his mouth lift a fraction. Their exchanges had grown easier, not because they talked more, but because the silences between them no longer carried tension. They worked, they ate, they slept under the same roof, and they fell into a life that felt earned, not forced. By midday, they walked the west side of the property together. Nokomi's carried a small hatchet to trim low tree branches, and Marcus carried a bucket of nails to secure loose boards along the corral. They moved at the same pace, not too fast, not too slow. At one point, Nokomi stopped to adjust the strap on her boot. She had repaired it days earlier, reinforcing the worn sole with pieces of leather from the barn. Marcus waited beside her without comment, comfortable in the shade of a lone cottonwood. "You've done a month's worth of work in a week," Marcus said. "Work keeps my head clear. That why you stayed?" She glanced up, giving him a steady look. "No, I stayed because you didn't try to cage me." He absorbed the words without reply. She didn't mean physical confinement. She meant expectation, pressure, ownership, the things that had shaped too many parts of her past. Marcus continued along the fence line, and she fell in step beside him. When they finished the day's repairs, They returned to the cabin where the table had been moved slightly to make more space for their combined belongings. Marcus retrieved 2 mugs, filling them with warm water from the kettle. Nokomi sat near the window, watching a hawk glide across the sky. She studied the bird's movements not for symbolism, but for understanding, how it turned into the wind, how it balanced itself in open space. "You have no reason to keep me," she said suddenly. Marcus paused mid-step. "I didn't keep you. You know what I mean?" She turned toward him, eyes steady. "I'm large. People stare. Men laugh or challenge. Women fear I'll break their husbands in half. My tribe didn't want someone like me. Settlers think I'm unnatural. Yet you don't react. I see a person who works hard," Marcus said plainly, "who carries more weight than anyone should, who stands straight even when the world tries to push her down." Nokomi's lowered her gaze for the first time that day, not out of shame, but because the truth hit deeper than expected. She had encountered men who used her strength to mock her, men who tried to test themselves against her, and men who wanted to diminish her to inflate their own worth. Marcus had done none of those things. She lifted her eyes again. "I need to tell you something." "All right. I'm carrying a child." Marcus stopped breathing for a moment, not in shock, not in fear, but in quiet recognition of how much this declaration meant. She didn't deliver it as a plea, nor as a warning. She said it as a fact she had measured carefully before speaking aloud. He watched her place a hand over her lower stomach, her fingers steady, her expression calm. "When?" Marcus asked, voice low. "Not long ago," she answered. "Before I found your land. I knew before my wrist healed, but I waited to be sure." He stepped closer, giving her space to step back if she needed. She didn't move. "You sure you want to stay here?" he asked. "Yes," she said firmly. "If I leave, I walk alone again. If I remain, my child grows in a place without shouting or fists or people trying to make me smaller. And you?" Her voice softened just a fraction. "You don't run from responsibility." Marcus let the words sink in. He had spent years believing he wasn't meant to build a family, not because he doubted the idea, but because the life he had chosen seemed too solitary for anyone else to live in. Now a new possibility stood right in front of him, delivered without fear or demand. "Then we do this right," he said. "How?" she asked. "We marry. Not for show. Not for town gossip. For us. For the child." Nokomi's straightened her shoulders, not in resistance, but in careful consideration. She wasn't a woman who agreed to anything lightly. After a moment that stretched between them with quiet weight, she nodded once. "Yes," she said. "If we marry, it is because we choose each other. Nothing else." Marcus reached out and took her hand, not forceful, not hesitant, just steady. She accepted his grip fully, and their hands remained joined without tension. 2 days later, they rode into the small settlement 10 miles east. The blacksmith performed the ceremony, signing the paper with ink that smelled faintly of coal smoke. Nokomi stood tall beside Marcus, ignoring the whispers from bystanders who couldn't understand her size or his calm acceptance. Marcus kept his hand at her back the entire time, not to guide her, but to reassure her she wasn't alone. When they returned home that evening, the plains glowed under the late sun. Marcus helped her dismount, and she rested a hand on her stomach with a protective instinct she hadn't shown before. Together, they walked toward the cabin, their cabin now, with a shared understanding that this place belonged to both of them. Inside, Nokomi's moved to the bed she had chosen weeks earlier. Marcus stood near the doorway, watching her settle into the space that had changed shape around her presence. She looked at him with steady certainty. "We build our own life now," she said. "Yes," he replied. "All 3 of us." The plains outside stretched into quiet evening, holding the sound of wind against the grass. Inside, the warmth of a new beginning settled around them, anchored by choice, solidified by commitment, and strengthened by the child who would grow in the safety they had created together. There were no doubts left, no questions, no unfinished paths. Their life, from this moment forward, belonged to both of them, fully and freely.